Welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city. And as we tell these stories, we try to represent the 450 years of which Pensacola had played a part. And part of that story over time has involved military services, actual wars and battles in some cases. But today my preference and my title is to deal with the military services as we enjoy them in the 21st century here. And to begin with, how did these services get to Northwest Florida in the first place? Well, really, the story begins with two presidents who never set foot anywhere near Pensacola. These were Presidents James Monroe and John Quincy Adams. Just a word, first of all, about the two men themselves. James Monroe was a Virginian, brought up in a farming family there. He studied at William and Mary College, studied law under Thomas Jefferson, and over the period of his time, he was a soldier in the Revolution. He served as a part of the Virginia Burgesses. He later on became a United States Senator. He was the governor of the state, and overall, his career just led him to the presidency, which began, of course, for him with the election of 1816. John Quincy Adams, on the other hand, was, of course, the son of the second president of the United States, and he had the opportunity to travel with his father all across Western Europe when the father was assigned to duties in both Russia and England, as well as later on in France. And John Quincy Adams, in the course of his time, became the minister to Russia and then a minister to England, and of course spent additional time in France. And he was a very, very well-rounded man when he accepted the presidency. But before that, John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State with James Monroe, and that is our story as of today. Now, we take a look at the situation in the world in the year 1819. At this point in time, the area to the south of us, what we today term as Latin America, had begun literally to fall apart politically. This had been a Spanish empire since the 16th century, but by the time we get to the late 18 teens, virtually all of the countries in that hemisphere had revolted, had set up their own countries, and the United States government itself was very concerned lest Britain and France, or both of them, might step into that power vacuum. And so planning was afoot to say, how can we prevent that? At the same time, we were also concerned about what the Russians were doing on the West Coast. And this was where our story really began. In 1821, the Russian Tsar, who then was Alexander I, had eyes upon extending his Alaskan holdings farther to the south, claiming land which the United States by now had claimed, of course, through the purchase of Louisiana. We wanted to stop this if we possibly could. And it was then that Secretary of State John Quincy Adams wrote a memorandum which was transmitted to Alexander I, who, of course, he had come to know well through his service in St. Petersburg. That memorandum, I want to read you the exact lines of it because it's short and it's bear remembered. This is what John Quincy Adams sent on to the Tsar. The American continents, by the free and independent condition they have assumed, and henceforth are not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power. That's all it said. The Tsar got the message and he backed off. We moved forward just about 2 years, and of course by now the situation in Latin America was becoming even more heated as far as we were concerned in our country, and action had to be taken, and this was when Monroe and Adams, acting jointly, began their work. Now, as it turned out, the British were, at this point in time, they were not as red hot as we had feared they might be about moving into that hemisphere itself. So their foreign minister, a man named George Canning, tended to work a little bit with John Quincy Adams, but we can only say that this was in 1823. This was an American show. So, and we come to the month of December, 1823, Mr. Adams goes before the Congress with a message to the Congress from President Monroe. And basically he was outlining to the senators and congressmen their concern about the Latin American situation. And once again, I want to read you this because it's exactly the same statement that he had sent to the Tsar just 2 years before. And it said, "The American continents by the free and independent condition they have assumed, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power. Now, that little phrase, those two lines together, are what we today have turned over the last 2 centuries. That is the Monroe Doctrine. And that was the word that was being sent out by our Congress, by our diplomats, to all of the rest of the world. Well, of course, those are simply words. What do you do to enforce your ability to do something if some foreign power decided they were going to try and move into that situation? So basically, here's what our country began to do. And this was backed fully by Mr. Monroe and Mr. Adams as the President and the Secretary of State, because they had to work together to get the congressional approval and, of course, the full backing of the Department of the Navy and also a little bit later of the Coast Artillery. And here's what they did. Number one, they determined that we were now going to create, for the first time, a South Atlantic naval fleet. This was to be the deterrent for any foreign power attempting to move into the Western Hemisphere. But of course, having a fleet is useless unless you have a place that is going to be its home port for its maintenance and support. So the next step was, we've got to create a Navy Yard. Well, where is it going to be? That was the next question. And of course, we had nothing of that sort along the South Atlantic at this point. So the Navy Department established a team of 3 men, 3 Commodores, and these men proceeded to tour all of the bays and inlets of the Gulf of Mexico to decide where should this Navy Yard be. And the net result was they chose Pensacola. The 3 men, incidentally, were all Commodores. There were Lewis Warrington, James Biddle, and James Bainbridge. They were the ones that chose Pensacola, and the decision was made. And the Navy Department then appointed Lewis Warrington to be the man to come to Pensacola and to put the Navy Yard in position. And he began his work with a survey. He went out into the hinterland and acquired 10,000 acres of fine pine and fine oak, which of course would supply the wood sources needed for building or maintenance ships. And then he used what we today call a headhunter among the Navy yards up to along the North Atlantic coast to supply to the skilled men that they needed to do the work of building a Navy yard and of course working on ships. And this is what they did. The men were put together. Of course, you couldn't have these men stay in the village in the city itself. It's too far remote. So Mr. Warrington started a village where these people would live, and the men came down. They were given opportunities to build their own houses, and they did. And so we had the beginnings of, first of all, the Navy Yard itself, its beginnings, its people, its land, its workmen and supplies, and Mr. Warrington had done his job. Now, you can't just simply put a Navy Yard in place out there. You've got to be able to defend it in case there should be attacked by sea or land. And this was the next step, again, being supported by the outgoing President Monroe and the incoming President John Quincy Adams. They put together the plan and the funding to create a series of 4 fortifications that would be face the water, 3 of them would, and also to face an attack by land. And to put these things together, the Department of the Army chose a young Army captain, a graduate of West Point, by the name of William Henry Chase. Chase came to Pensacola after other services along the Mississippi, and he was given the job. He had the plans already drawn by people in the Coast Artillery to build the fortifications. These, of course, were to become Fort Pickens, Fort McRae, Fort Barrancas, and what we call the Redoubt. To put his whole plan together, of course, Mr. Chase had to have a great source of supply. So he literally went out and made contracts with local people to start 7 brickyards up the Escambia River and 7 new lumber yards, which would provide the basic woods that he was going to need in the forts. Now, this is different kinds of timber, of course, than was required for building ships. These seven yards of 7 lumber yards, 7 brickyards were put together, and by the year 1828, the flow of supplies was moving, and Mr. Chase also had the foresight to lease one of the first steam tugs ever put together in this country. And basically what they would do is assemble the supplies up the river, float them down the river on small barges, and then the steam tug would take the barges out to the source of where the construction was going to be. The second thing Mr. Chase had, just as Warrington had, you had to have a source of skilled labor. Now, he did something very different than in the 21st century that certainly would not be considered a very politically correct thing to do. But in that era, many young Army officers used the extra cash that they had. Instead of buying stocks and bonds, they purchased young Negro slaves on the slave market, put them in what we would call trade schools, and they were prepared to do the various trade skills that perform the trade skills that were needed. And it was this sort of labor. About 40 of these men were leased by Captain Chase, brought to Pensacola, and they were the labor that put the forts together. All of this began, as I say, in the latter part of 1828. Mr. Adams is now taking office within just a couple of months, and as Monroe exited and Adams moved in, the two men worked closely together with the Congress to be sure there would be an oncoming flow of money. It was necessary, of course, to do all the things you needed to put the Navy Yard together, and then, of course, the forts would accompany them. Well, Chase did his job just as Warrington had done. Work began, and the skills were being applied. And as they did so, of course, the first flow was through for Mr. Warrington. His work was recognized, and he was promoted. And he was succeeded here in Pensacola by another commander by the name of Melanchthon Woolsey. And Mr. Woolsey did his job, picked up right where Commander Warrington had left off. But of course, by now, sufficient men had come here. Men and their families had come here as laborers, workers in the yard. They had filled up the original Warrington village. So Mr. Woolsey said, well, we've got to have another one. So he laid out still a second village right out there adjacent to the Navy Yard itself. And so people began to flow in, and with the same sort of ego that Mr. Warrington had, we now have another village, and this one is named for the commander as well. So we have Woolsey Village as well as Warrington, and so people can continue to move in, and it was working very, very well. All right. As this proceeded, people in the Pensacola, of course, were extremely anxious and very interested in what these people were doing. And into the early part of the summer of 1834, the first of the forts was completed. And so on one Sunday afternoon, everything that floated carried people out there as interested spectators that they had a dedication ceremony for Fort Pickens. So the first job was done. Over 20 million brick had gone into that yard. And I would urge you, if in the audience, next time you're out to any of these forts that we have here, look at the workmanship that these people put together. It is a beautiful, beautiful piece of masonry, and the fort was considered a wonderful success. Well, they started at once, of course, to build the second fort right across the inlet from Fort Pickens. This was to be Fort McRae. Fort McRae was half the size of Fort Pickens, and I should have mentioned also that when they completed Fort Pickens, they inserted about 200 cannon of different kinds, and when they finished Fort McRae, about 3 years later, they had about half that number, about 100 cannon in that. Fort Barrancas came next. It was on the highlands. Actually, that's what the Spanish term means, the highlands, and they put this particular fort together. It took them about 7 years to build that one, another beautiful piece of work done right alongside the Navy Yard itself, and by the time that was finished, now the Coast Artillery Department was using the fort for a little bit anyway for training purposes, although that was suspended for quite some time and not picked up again until after the Civil War. The final piece of work done in this whole series, again, funded by work that had been begun by Monroe and Adams. That final piece of work was the redoubt. The redoubt was not finished until 1849. And when it was finished, of course, one of the ironies of the whole thing was that by that time, any concern that the United States might have had over Britain or France trying to move into the power vacuum in the area of Latin America was gone. So basically, after the initial excitement of getting the forts built, they sat there and they were basically silent until the year 1861. But we have to look back now and look at the work that was done here in the early days by Warrington and Woolsey and Chase, but also we need to never forget that all of this never would have happened if our two presidents, Mr. Monroe and Mr. Adams, had not put their eyes on the situation as it existed then, took the steps to make sure that we had a response in this country, and then went about the equally important thing of getting the plans done and done properly and raising the money to do it. That's what they did, Monroe and Adams, and I hope we will never forget the work that they did on our benefit as we see it here in Pensacola today.